Good afternoon and welcome to A Conversation with Mohamed El-Erian. I am Steve Rosansky, President and CEO of the Newport Beach Chamber of Commerce. We're delighted to be able to bring to you today the opportunity to hear Dr. El-Erian talk about his newest book, The Only Game in Town. For those of you who are not familiar with the Newport Beach Chamber of Commerce, we are a 109-year-old membership organization consisting of 650 businesses doing business in the greater Newport Beach area. Our organizational pillars are community, advocacy, education, and connection. It is through the support of our members that we can bring to you quality programming that we are well known for. An event like this can't come together without the help and support of many individuals. There are several I would particularly like to acknowledge at this time. First is Paul Bullwinkle, sitting over here to the left. Paul is a UCLA Anderson MBA alum who came to me with the idea of having Mohamed speak at a chamber event, and I said, great, Paul, go to it, and he did, and so we're here today. And so I want to thank Paul, because without his help, we would not be having this program. Second is Bart Young. Unfortunately, Bart got called away at the last minute, so he's not here, but I do still want to recognize him. Bart is the CEO and creative director for The Young Company, a marketing communications company located in Laguna Beach. Bart was instrumental in getting the word out to a number of Orange County MBA alumni associations. Any MBA alumni people here today? Okay, a few. Worked. Including his own Berkeley Haas. The last one I'd like to recognize is Rob Collins, who's also sitting over here to the left. Rob's a business performance advisor at Insperity, who also promoted this event as well as others to the UCLA Anderson alumni community. Furthermore, I would like to thank Cynthia Newcomb. I hope she's here. I didn't see her come. Is Cynthia here? Raise your hand, Cynthia. You here? Oh, back row? Hey, there she is, back there, Cynthia Newcomb. Cynthia is a senior executive assistant to Richard Riesman, and I'd also like to recognize Irene Hill. I think she's probably at the same table. Irene, back there? Yep, thank you, Irene. She's the executive assistant to Dr. El-Erian for all their help in putting this program together today. Lastly, I'd like to acknowledge our table sponsors this afternoon. We have Tim Shields with George & Shields. Tim? Raise your hand. Thank you. David Wagner with Morgan Stanley. Kim Tavares, PacWest Accounting. Bob Martinez, Farmers and Merchants Bank. Ann Britannia, Gensler and Associates. Did I pronounce that right, Ann? Gensler? I never know. And Maureen Flanagan with First Republic Bank. Okay, so just so you have an idea of how things are going to progress this afternoon, as the staff is serving lunch, please take a few minutes to meet your table mates and enjoy your meal. When we start up again, I will introduce our moderator, Richard Riesman, and our featured speaker, Dr. Mohamed El-Erian, who I am sure will receive a thorough grilling from Richard about his ideas that he's put forth in The Only Game in Town. Towards the end, we'll open it up for question and answer. And at the conclusion of the program, Dr. El-Erian has agreed to sign books for those who've purchased them. If you didn't purchase one, we have a few left, so you can do that after the program is over. They're $25 a piece. We'll be doing the signing at the table immediately outside this door to the left. And as a side note, the hotel's informed me that if you self-park, the parking will be free. So make sure if you have your parking ticket, you get it pushed through the validation machine at the check-in desk. Please enjoy your meal, and we'll be back shortly. Thank you. I hope everyone has had an opportunity to meet their table mates and enjoy the meal. It's now time to introduce our guests and begin our program, A Conversation with Mohamed El-Erian. Our moderator this afternoon is someone that is well recognized in Orange County business circles, and I'm sure many of you are a subscriber of his, Richard Riesman, publisher and CEO of the Orange County Business Journal. Survivors, yeah. Survivor of the Journal? Is that a contest you're running? Okay, sorry. Richard joined the Business Journal in 1990. Since then, the publication's acceptance by the business community has been dramatic. Paid circulation has grown fivefold, making it now one of the top 2 business journals in California. Prior to the Orange County Business Journal, Richard was director of marketing for the Orange County edition of the Los Angeles Times. Earlier in his career, he practiced law in San Francisco and Washington, D.C., and while in private practice in Washington, Richard served as special counsel to the House Ethics Committee. Do they have ethics there at the committee?
It's in quotes.
In quotes, okay. It was in quotes, that's true. He holds an MBA from UCLA, where he was awarded the R.C. Baker Foundation Fellowship and a law degree from George Washington University, where he graduated with honors. Please join me in welcoming our moderator, Richard Riesman. And now I'd like to introduce our esteemed author and guest today, Dr. Mohamed El-Erian. Looks like you're going to get multiple applauses today. Mohamed El-Erian is Chief Economic Advisor at El-Erian, the corporate parent of PIMCO, where he formerly served as Chief Executive and Co-Chief Investment Officer. He chairs President Obama's Global Development Council, is also a columnist for Bloomberg View, and a contributing editor at the Financial Times. Dr. El-Erian first joined PIMCO in 1999 and was a senior member of PIMCO's Portfolio Management and Investment Strategy Group. He rejoined the company at the end of 2007 after serving 2 years as president and CEO of the Harvard Management Company, the entity that manages Harvard's endowment and related accounts. Before coming to PIMCO, Dr. El-Erian was a managing director at Salomon Smith Barney Citigroup in London, and before that he spent 15 years at the IMF, International Monetary Fund, in Washington, D.C. Dr. El-Erian has published widely on international economic and financial topics. His 2008 book, When Markets Collide, was a New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestseller, won the Financial Times Goldman Sachs Business Book of the Year Award, and was named a Book of the Year by The Economist and one of the best business books of all time. Wow, that's pretty good, all time. By The Independent. He was named to Foreign Policy's list of top 100 global thinkers for 4 years in a row, and he served on the 2014 and 2015 juries for the Financial Times Mackenzie Book of the Year Award. His new book, published in January 2016, right here, The Only Game in Town, Central Banks, Instability, and Avoiding the Next Collapse, is a New York Times bestseller. Dr. El-Erian has served on several boards and committees, including the U.S. Treasury Borrowing Advisory Committee, the International Center for Research on Women, the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the IMF's Committee of Eminent Persons, and the New York Fed Investor Advisor Committee on Financial Markets. He is currently a board member of the NBER, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, New America, and Cambridge in America. Since 2007, he's been the chair of Microsoft's Investment Advisory Board. He holds a master's degree and a doctorate in economics from Oxford University and received his undergraduate degree from Cambridge University. He's also an honorary fellow of Queen's College, Cambridge University. And with all that, I understand from a well-placed source sitting in the back of the room that he takes his daughter to school every day.
You still do?
Please welcome Dr. Mohamed El-Erian.
I guess we can begin. I'm going to walk through the book with Dr. El-Erian, and because I expect most of you haven't yet read it since you are here to buy it and have it signed. Then I'm going to open it up to questions, and I'll recognize people in the audience. But there is one ground rule. There is to be no questions about that investment advisory firm around the corner called PIMCO, and there's to be no questions about any of his colleagues from that organization. Let's begin.
Presumably, when you finish through the book, they don't have to read it anymore, right? And did I get the money back?
I don't think so. I think it's important to read this book. It's an important book, and I think after you hear us discuss it, you'll be able to appreciate it all the more. So to begin with, the book itself is called The Only Game in Town. What is the game? What is the only game in town?
Okay, before I start, let me just thank everybody for being here. It really is wonderful of you to give up your precious time and come. And it's wonderful to see old friends, acquaintances that I haven't seen. And in the back of the room, in addition to Irene, there's also Chacha and two people who support me every single day. And without them, I wouldn't be able to function. So I want to thank them very publicly for that. The only game in town are a set of secretive institutions who hate to be in the limelight, who have had no choice but to step in and basically save the global economy from not only depression, but from a prolonged recession. And now, these institutions that like to be behind the scenes have two dilemmas. One is they're becoming less effective, and there's no one to hand off to. And two is they're becoming more political. Now here I'm talking about central banks in general, and specifically 4 central banks that are very important for the global economy. The Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, and the Bank of England. All 4 are doing things they never imagined that they would do, have been doing it for much longer than they would ever wish to do, and are very uncertain about the consequences of their actions.
Well, how do central banks operate in dealing with the financial crisis? What did they do to save the day?
So there were 4 phases up to the global financial crisis, call it 2008. Central banks basically stepped back because they believed that finance was sophisticated, that finance could manage its own risk, and therefore they shouldn't intervene. It was called the light touch regulation. That ended up in tears when the world woke up to the fact that too much risk was taken, and there wasn't enough understanding of what that risk implied. And we got the global financial crisis. The next phase is what I call whatever it takes. Central banks went in there and were ready to do anything in order to stop a global depression.
Is that 2008?
2008, 2009. So if you look at what they've done, it's absolutely remarkable. Absolutely remarkable. They threw everything. They weren't sure whether things would stick or not, but they threw everything at the wall, hoping that something would stick, and a few things did stick. Come 2010, they really want to declare mission accomplished, and they want to get out of this business. But they look around, and if you remember, 2010 was the emergence of the Tea Party in the United States. And there's basically no functioning Congress to hand off. There's no other policy entity to come in and take over the work of the central banks. So the central banks in 2010 felt, and these are their words, morally and ethically obliged to continue to do the heavy lifting. And in a very famous speech in 2010, Chairman Bernanke, who was then the head of the Fed, said, "We will continue, but there are benefits, costs, and risks, because we're not the right people to be doing this. And the longer we continue being the only game in town, the lower the benefits, the higher the costs and the risks." And they never imagined that they would be the only game in town for so long. So the final phase right now is when they are becoming ineffective. And the Bank of Japan is ineffective today. The ECB is starting to become ineffective. And the Fed wants to get out of this business before it becomes ineffective. So there's been 4 very clear phases. And for those who want an image, think of the central bank as your doctor. Okay? They see you collapsing, they will rush to help you. Even if they don't have the right medication, they will do their utmost to help you. They will give you other medication, hoping that they can keep you in one piece until the right doctors appear. But good doctors never walk away from their patients. And the reason why these central banks have continued, even though they don't have the right tools, is because they're like doctors. They will not walk away. They just hope that the other doctors, which are controlled by the politicians, finally come in and help.
Let's talk about what the central banks have done. To begin with, they infused liquidity when there was no liquidity. We worried whether or not if we went to our ATM machine, where the money would come out. So let's start with that, what they did then. But then, of course, now, with the repression of interest rates, how they're doing that and what's the theory of why that should work, and has it worked?
Okay, how many of you remember 2008? Okay. Now, what made 2008 particularly scary is people stopped trusting each other. They didn't trust the basic element, which is called payments and settlement. You pay, and then you settle a day later. The example I use with my daughter is you go, on PCH, you go to McDonald's, and it's a very efficient element. Why? You order, then you go to one window where you pay, and then you drive a few yards, and you receive where you settle. And the system is built to be incredibly efficient. Now, what happened in 2008? People came up, they ordered the Big Mac. They went to the first window, and they were told $5. And they said, wait a minute, I heard that Lehman failed yesterday. And I heard that people got caught offside. So I'm willing to pay, but where's my Big Mac? And the answer was, trust the next few feet, and you'll collect the Big Mac. And the people said, I heard what happened in Lehman. I'm not trusting these few feet. So what happened? The person who was willing to order and to eat the Big Mac leaves even though they have the money, and the next window throws away the Big Mac even though they have the food. That is what happened in 2008. The payments and settlement system broke down. And that's why all of you remember it, right? Because everything started collapsing. So the central banks came in and said, I am the payments and settlement system. I will stand. I will guarantee these few yards. Absolutely critical. Had they not done that, multi-year depression that would have impacted not just us, but our kids. Then they started saying, okay, for all these securities that people are stuck, they don't have liquidity, I'm going to buy them. So we had massive purchases of all sorts of things. Real estate, everything you can imagine, they started buying. Then they, with the Treasury, came in with a very controversial top, which basically said, I'm even going to put money in the banks. I'm going to stand behind the banks and do that. And then, of course, they lowered interest rates and kept them very low. So they used purchases and the price mechanism to do that. They've continued doing the same thing, and it's gotten a bit absurd. If you're sitting in Europe today, to give you an example, if you're sitting in Europe today, it's negative interest rates. Think about that. You lend your money, and you pay people for the privilege of lending the money. Negative interest rates are now prevailing for a third of global government debt. That is how far this game has continued. Right? Now, it doesn't take long to realize that if you run a market-based capitalist system at negative interest rates, things start breaking down. And that's what we're starting to see in Japan, and we will start seeing in Europe. So it's been basically, I'll buy the assets, QE as it's called, and I will keep interest rates as low as possible and even be willing to take them negative. And why are they doing this? And I'll stop here. Because they want to encourage you to take risk. They want you to sit there and say, you know what? I am not going to pay interest on government debt, or I'm not going to invest in a CD that pays me 0.05%. I'm not going to do that. They are pushing you to take more risk. Why? Because as we all collectively take more risk, we boost asset prices. We boost the stock market. Then we open up our Morgan Stanley statements, and suddenly we feel rich. And what do we do if we feel rich? We're supposed to trigger what's called the wealth effect. We're supposed to go out and spend more. As we spend more, businesses see that there's more demand for their products, so they invest more. And next thing you know, the whole economy picks up. So the reason why interest rates are pushed so low, the reason why they buy assets is to collectively push us to take more risk. Not because they like us taking more risk, because that's the only way they can stimulate economic growth.
Well, then, if people feel wealthier, they buy things.
Right.
They consume services. Then the hope, I would guess, would be that the productive economy starts to invest, and now you have real growth because people are serving the needs of those people. Is that what's going on, and is that working?
That's what's supposed to happen, and that's what hasn't happened. Okay?
Or has it happened some?
Not enough. So, for example, U.S. companies today are sitting on the biggest amount of cash they've ever had. And sitting on lots of cash that earns zero is not a great idea. It's also not a great idea because you attract the activists. Because the activists say, oh, well, if there's all this cash, I can come in and I can monetize it. So companies, believe me, do not like sitting on a massive amount of cash. Mm-hmm. The reason why they're sitting on a massive amount of cash is because they see through the central banks. They say, that's fine. I understand what the central banks are trying to do, but who really is going to reform the corporate tax system? Who really is going to invest in infrastructure? Who really is going to do all this stuff we need to generate high economic growth? And they don't have the confidence that that's going to happen. So the irony is that financial risk-taking is up here, and economic risk-taking is down here, right? And that's why, despite everything that the central banks have done, they haven't got the response. There isn't a single time that the Fed has not had to revise down its growth estimates since 2010. Think about that. A single time that they haven't revised down their growth estimate. They've had every single time they've overestimated the reaction of the business community.
So they've succeeded in inflating assets.
Correct.
So there is the top tier of society is wealthier because their assets have gone up in value. But have they not demanded goods and services? Or they have, but productive enterprises just haven't increased their investment to serve them?
So some facts. We have grown collectively at 2% per year. Our potential is about 3%, okay? But we've grown at 2%. The vast majority of the income generated has gone to the rich. So also the last few years has seen a significant worsening of income inequality and wealth inequality. Now, why is that important economically? Forget whether you think it's good or bad, right? And we can argue till tomorrow morning. But there's something that is unambiguous in economics. The rich spend less of the incremental income than the poor. It's called the marginal propensity to consume. So when the rich get all the income, they will spend less of it than if it was distributed to more evenly. So you end up with insufficient demand in the economy. Deficient aggregate demand is what the economists call it. So part of the irony is while the Fed has had no choice but to boost asset prices, and who owns the asset prices? The rich. And most of the return to business has been to the rich, right? That in itself has complicated the Fed's job because it has worsened income inequality, and therefore not only do you have a structural problem, corporate tax reform not happening, infrastructure not happening, but you also have a demand problem. And that's why this is proving to be such a stubborn situation.
It sounds like these are basic economic principles that were known beforehand. So didn't the Fed know that what they were going to do would fail?
No, what the Fed knew from day one is what Bernanke called benefits, costs, and risks. That what they were going to do will have some benefits, but will have collateral damage, cost, and unintended consequences, risks. And his assessment was that's okay because we're not going to do it for very long because our politicians will get their act together and because there's no alternative. And I suspect most of us, again like the doctor, would have done the same thing. Okay? A few of us would have been willing to say, let's have a cleansing depression that will clean up the system and it will bounce back stronger. But most people, won't let their child put their hand in the fire. You know, the logic said, let your child get burned. They'll never put their hand in the fire again. But how many parents are actually willing to do that? Right? So most people, I think, would have done what Bernanke have done. The big miscalculation was that we would get the politics so wrong. I mean, if I had sat here a year ago and told you that Donald Trump would be the presumptive Republican nominee, and I would have told you a year ago that a self-declared socialist would still be in the race against Hillary Clinton, what would you have thought of me? Okay? That is how bad our politics are, right? And no one imagined that our politics would paralyze our economics like this.
Why is the politics so much worse today, if that's what you're saying, than they've been in the past?
Because people are angry. People are angry. People are angry first and foremost that they lost their jobs because of the irresponsibility of banks. They're angry because these banks got bailed out and they didn't get bailed out. They're angry because growth has been low. They're angry because the benefits of growth have gone to a few people and not to everybody else. And they're angry because they believe that the Chinese, the Mexicans are actually responsible for all this. So when people get angry, And it's not just here. In Europe, you have exactly the same phenomenon with the growth of the anti-establishment parties. That's the common element around the world. When people get angry, they want the establishment out. They don't trust the establishment. Private and public, by the way. Big companies have as much of a trust deficit as the political establishment. So they will vote for an alternative. Now, the thing to realize is you actually don't need these alternatives to get to power. They can change governance without getting fired. The UK today is on the verge of a referendum as to whether they should exit the European Union or not, so-called Brexit. That referendum would not have been called had the equivalent of their Tea Party, UKIP, the UK Independent Party, not gained a lot of support ahead of the general election. In order for the Conservative Party to solidify its base against the base migrating to UKIP, just like the Republican Party has seen its base migrate to Cruz or its base migrate to Trump, it had to offer something that was on UKIP's manifesto. What did it offer? It offered a referendum. So now we have great uncertainty. Is the UK going to get out of the EU? Is it not going to get out of the EU? So the amazing thing is you don't actually need the anti-establishment party to get to power. They start influencing. And if you don't believe me, look how far left Hillary Clinton has gone because of Bernie Sanders. And I'm not sure that she can re-pivot that easily, given the amount of support that Bernie Sanders has found.
So you're saying that the central banks had a policy beginning in 2000, well, 8 and 9 they added liquidity, 10 they started to repress interest rates in order to increase asset values, create wealth, and to try to get the system started. Now it's 5, 6 years later. No other political actors have come into play. If they don't come into play, can the central bank's policies alone get us back to a strong economy?
No.
And that's because, and
Okay.
why?
If you ask what are the 4 things we need, most economists agree on this. And it's amazing to get economists to agree on what these 4 things are. They may disagree on what is most important, but they'll agree that you need 4 things, and they'll agree that you don't need a big policy bang because there's so much cash on the sideline. A small policy bang is enough to unleash the cash and then let the private sector do it. So first, we need to reinvigorate growth engines. You can't rely on finance to generate growth. You can't rely on leverage to generate growth. We need to reform the tax system. We have one of the least pro-growth tax systems in the world. Why? Because it's full of exemptions. It hasn't been looked at properly since the mid-'80s. We need to build better infrastructure. We need to be more serious about our labor force, about retraining our labor force. So there's a whole set of so-called structural reforms that allow you to grow faster. Then we need to really think about the demand side. How do you deal with the fact that there isn't enough demand? Then it gets a little bit even more difficult. We have to deal with pockets of over-indebtedness. And that's really hard to do. No one likes to forgive debt. You don't want to forgive debt. Why should I forgive your debt? I've been paying. Okay, why am I going to forgive your debt? And what incentive am I going to create for Richard, who's going to stop paying his debt so that he can be forgiven as well? Right? So don't get me wrong, debt forgiveness is really, really hard. But certain students today, certain people with student loans today are going to get crushed by their student loans. And we as a society have to make a decision as to what is the lesser evil of these 2 things. And the 4th thing we need to do is lead again, because we have stopped doing this, lead again in global policy coordination. The world is like an orchestra that's supposed to play together because everybody's interconnected, but they have different sheets of paper and no conductor. So it's really not very coherent. Now, these 4 things are not an engineering problem. They are a political implementation question. Why am I citing them? Because the central banks cannot do any of these 4 things. So to answer your question, no, because they cannot deliver on these 4 things, and they know it. By the way, the title of the only game in town, as I say in the book, it's not mine. I was sitting in a central bank gathering where there were over 100 governors of central banks. and it was hosted in Paris by the governor, the outgoing governor of the central bank there. And he got up and said, "We are the only game in town and we don't like it." Mm-hmm. That's his phrase, not mine.
All right, so Donald Trump becomes the next president, and he's really tired of not having the life he used to enjoy and playing golf and running around. And he says, Mohamed, I read your book. Why don't you run the country? I'll make, I'll sign I'll make the speeches you want me to make. So you get to run the country because Donald's delegated that to you, at least from the point of view of the executive branch. So what's the first steps? What do we do?
So first thing, if ever, this will never ever happen.
Really?
But in the world of wild and crazy, okay, I would tell him, you don't need me. Okay, you don't need me. In fact, most economists, but you need to go to Congress immediately. And you need to tell them that we are facing what I call in the book a T-junction. That's what the British have for this sort of intersection. The road that we're on is going to end. Central banks are no longer going to be able to deliver what they have been delivering. And I can tell you, if you haven't noticed yet, the signs are all around you. So the road we're on is going to end. But what comes next is subject to political decision. There is nothing predestined. All of those who say we're going to end up in a recession and all that, it's a maybe, it's not a definite. In fact, the probability is as high as we taking another turn towards much higher growth and genuine financial stability. The contrast is that stark. It is a T-junction. And who decides where we come out is not going to be Donald Trump. It's going to be Congress. It's going to be the ability of Congress to do a few very basic things on which there is quite a bit of agreement if they weren't terrified about the next election.
So talk about those things. What do we need to do?
Corporate tax reform.
Okay.
Okay, I don't know a single person that I've come across that has looked at that, including on both sides of the House, who doesn't think that corporate tax reform is really needed, that we have stumbled through all the little changes we've done into a system that actually discourages economic growth. Okay. So if you're a big company with a ton of cash outside, you don't want to bring it back, that's one example. But there's many, many, many examples where we've ended up with a system that actually discourages company from investing in their businesses and growing them. Infrastructure investment. You don't feel it in Newport Beach because we're pretty special, but go anywhere else in the world.
We could use a new city hall.
But
no one's laughing. Okay.
But we really have a problem with infrastructure. Our airports are awful. Our ports are awful. Okay? And with interest rates so low, and with the ability to have private-public partnerships, this is something we can solve. We haven't done that. Okay? We can do that. This is all. None of this is really hard from an engineering perspective. You just need politicians to say, yes, we're going to have an infrastructure program.
How does that help?
Immediately creates demand. It lowers the cost for businesses. Okay? It makes us more competitive again, so we stop losing jobs. And it will trigger, and I keep on going back there, it will trigger the productive engagement of cash that companies have on their balance sheets.
The infrastructure investment.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. There is massive scope for private-public partnerships. But the system, and I don't know whether you know, but for the last 6 years, we haven't had the annual approval of a budget out of Congress. Now, you don't need to be an economist to know that budgeting is a basic element of economic governance. But we haven't been able to bring the parties together, so what do? We just roll over the budget. Now, there's been one exception last year, in the middle of the year, when there was a mini budget deal, but that was it. Now, the world has changed tremendously in the last 6 years. The country has changed tremendously in the last 6 years. It doesn't make sense that the most basic tool of economic management is frozen. This is what is called the can't, won't, or shouldn't Congress. I can't do it, I won't do it, or I shouldn't do it. Right? And the result of that is you don't get anything. So that's what stops infrastructure spending. That's what stops corporate tax reform. And you really need it if you're going to change in a significant
Those are the
way.
two main things we need to do. And the infrastructure investment, I take it, would be through deficit spending. So we're also doing some Keynesian economics there where we're just spending more than we have and creating demand.
So you can do a lot of it through private-public partnership, but let's assume you can't. Yes, but at such low interest rates, and in Europe at negative interest rates, doesn't it make sense to invest in infrastructure where the returns are higher?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Think of Europe. You can borrow money and get paid. Who wouldn't do that? Okay, I mean, who wouldn't do that? And governments can easily do that and embark on infrastructure programs, but there's complete paralysis. And what paralyzes people is not whether it's a good idea, is that I don't want to be seen collaborating with the other side. Why? In 2 years' time, when I run again for the House, my major threat is not going to be Richard from the other side. It's going to be someone to the extreme of my party. Either a Tea Party person or a progressive person if you're a Democrat. And what will they be able to hold against me? That I collaborated with Richard. So even though it's a good idea, we won't collaborate.
So it's not going to happen. What you just said needs to happen for that reason.
So as we get closer to the neck of the T, a few things are going to happen. Stock market volatility is going to become more frequent. Have you noticed for the last 5 days we've had 3-digit plus moves in the stock market? What fundamentally changed? The Fed has said, you know what? Don't depend on me as much as you depended on me in the past. And suddenly the markets start getting more nervous. Right? So as we get closer to this, we're going to see financial volatility increase, up and down, up and down. That will make people more nervous. If we were holding this in January, February, people were talking about a US recession. That's not so long ago. That's what happened last time we went through financial volatility. So my hope, not my expectation, my hope is that as we get closer to the T, the political system is going to start getting more pressured more and more by us. Why? Because we're going to worry about our future and that of our kids. And there's nothing that focuses our minds more than the threat of a recession. Okay.
So as we near the threat, as it becomes more certain to people, maybe that gets Congress to act.
Yeah, it's the so-called Sputnik moment. You're all too young, but in the 50s, the US woke up to the reality of the Soviet Union, the USSR, the evil empire, as Reagan called it, successfully sending up a satellite into space, Sputnik. And that became a very vivid illustration of the threat to national security. And next thing you know, the country came together and the political class came together and said, not only are we going to catch up with the Soviet Union in the space race, but we're going to get ahead. And we did. So what we need is the equivalent of an economic Sputnik moment. And this is easier because the engineering isn't as difficult as sending someone to the moon.
And will it make much difference whether Trump or Hillary Clinton is president when we get to this crisis?
I think Congress is critical. Do you get a functioning executive branch and legislative branch? Okay. So ironically, you want them both to swing one way or the other. Right? That's really what you want.
Is it an additional problem that we seem to be in our national elections, not just this country, but across the world, having people who are coming from outside the system, people who are more radical, people with less experience, people who are perhaps riling up the mob, feeding into the anger? Does that make it less likely we're going to have a solution?
So we have people here sitting from Greece. Last January, the Greeks did something that was totally unexpected. They voted in the coalition of the radical left. It's called Syriza, the coalition of the radical left. And they came with an agenda that scared the daylights out of the rest of Europe. We're going to renegotiate this, we're going to do this differently, we're going to do that differently, right? And the Greek people were so angry and fed up with having been in recession, with youth unemployment at 55%, that they basically said we have nothing to lose. So in comes these people who have been in opposition, okay? They turn up in Europe, they don't wear ties, they turn the system upside down, and they end up doing exactly what the previous government had done. Exactly what the previous government had done, okay? Because the reality of governance is that you can't do extreme things. In this country, you particularly can't do extreme things because the checks and balances are big. So I worry less about, the whole system being taken hostage by someone who is crazy. Okay, and I'm not making any political statement here. Okay. And in Europe, you have some pretty crazy parties that are getting a lot of votes. What I'd like to see is a functioning governance system. And if that happens, then some of the anger comes down, some of the trust deficit comes down, and you're able then to regain what is a huge potential. There's another side of this, which I talk about in the book, which is if you knew nothing about Washington, you would be so excited about the US economy right now because you have cash and you have innovations. And history tells you when you have the combination of cash and innovation, your future is really bright. So if you could somehow deal with Washington over there and operate over here, we'd be fine. But unfortunately, that's not how our world works.
So the cash is the big balance sheets that corporate America has?
Right.
That's the cash that's on the sidelines. And the innovations are things like the internet, sharing economy. Talk about some of the specifics, disintermediation, sharing economy, and how they create wealth, and why it's a good thing.
So let's start with where we are today. And this is an example that my colleague, Oliver Bade at Allianz uses because it really visualizes. A competitor of Marriott is Hilton. Hilton Corporation, 100 years to deliver 700,000 rooms to its clients around the world. 100 years, 700,000 rooms. Airbnb, never managed a hotel in their life, never constructed a hotel in life. And the people who started it knew nothing about hotels. Airbnb, in 6 years, now deliver 1 million rooms. That is how quickly innovation changes the world.
How does that help us?
It helps you because you, as a consumer, have tremendous more choice as to where you're going to stay. It helps you because you, as a producer, can now rent an existing asset that otherwise was generating nothing at all. So Uber is a perfect example, right? People with cars, okay, and we use our cars maybe 5% of the time. Right? So we are utilizing things more productively. So we've increased demand and we've increased supply. And that is a good thing, okay? More people get to do things they wouldn't otherwise do, and more people get to generate income they wouldn't otherwise generate.
Is that captured in GNP, or is this
It's
a
not.
benefit?
This stuff is captured very badly in GNP and in productivity statistics and in many other things.
So maybe we're better off than we realize, because these are things that are happening that are good, but they're not captured in our statistics?
Yeah, if you are part of the functioning economy, you're undoubtedly better off than you were before. If you happen to be marginalized, then you're much worse off. And if you happen to be a young person who can't get their job, you're in big, big trouble. Because the system produces more and more of you every year. So if you don't get a job quickly, you go from being unemployed to being unemployable. Because when confronted with someone fresh out of school, or someone who's been sitting at home for 5 years doing you don't know what, you will hire the person fresh out of school. So that's why these compositional issues, that's why you get these angry people that are so angry because they don't even see prospects for a better standard of living.
And what are some of the consequences of what's going on here, where you have this long-term unemployment, youth unemployment, less participation in the labor force, bigger inequality of wealth? How does that exacerbate the problem? And
so it paralyzes the politics, right? I mean, if we haven't quite realized that there are really dissatisfied people, 80% of the young voting in Democratic primaries have voted for Bernie Sanders. What is that telling you about how the youth feels today about the system? Okay. So we are running, I keep going back to this trust deficit. There's a very big perception out there that the private and the public establishment that the establishment has failed them, right? And they are responding by trying to see who they can vote in, even if that person stands no chance of winning. I mean, that's the irony of it. But they're giving a signal to the rest of the system, and either we hear it or we don't hear it.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. So think of your questions, and I'll call on you. And remember the ground rules. Those were serious ground rules. You're, of course, an economist, and you've written a book about the world's economy and the future. But you're also an investor. You were the CEO and co-chief investment officer of PIMCO. You ran a $30–40 billion fund at Harvard University. So for those in the room, give us your best thoughts. Given everything that's going on, where should people put their money to work today?
Yeah, that is a really hard question to ask because it depends what people's circumstances are.
I thought it was a softball.
It's not a softball at all. This is one of the hardest questions. So there's certain rules that are important. Okay, rule number one is if the difference is between investing $1 in a financial market or investing $1 in your kid's education, go for the latter. Okay, equipping your kids to be more agile for the world ahead of us is the most important investment you can make. We're not doing it as a country, unfortunately, so we should do it as an individual. Secondly, realize what the game that the central banks are playing. So if you're going to invest only in the stock market, that's fine, but realize that you're betting that the financial risk-taking that's already up here is going to be validated by economic risk-taking. So you're betting that the politicians are going to get their act together and they're going to push up the fundamentals. Okay? That's what you're betting on. Right? It's not starting from down here, it's starting from up here. Third, if you are lucky enough to come across opportunities that offer new content with a platform, that's what Uber has done, that's what Facebook has done, that's what Google has done. Platform and content is the most potent combination. Get on that train as soon as you can. Fourth, and we have some financial advisors in the room, okay, diversification is no longer enough for risk management because all the prices are distorted. So this is no longer a world in which when your equities go down, your bonds are going to go up because everything has been pushed up in price. Right? This is a world in which you either have to be willing to accept a lot more volatility, which means that if we're in February and the stock market has lost 11% like this, don't go out and sell because your bonds aren't going to compensate for that, or hold a lot more cash, okay? Because that's the only thing that will give resilience to your portfolio.
How do you like Newport Beach real estate?
In this crowd, you know, I think that makes a lot of sense. I worry a little bit about initial conditions, okay? But those sorts of investments always ask, if you're sitting, you know, Bill Gross always had this thing, and I just broke the rule.
It's still a rule, though.
But he said, you know, he used to say that if you're sitting in a room and you're investing, realize, if you're investing, realize it's like you're sitting at a table here. And look around the table and ask who's the fish in the table, who's the fish in the game, who has less information than you. And if you can't identify that person, get out, okay? Right. And a lot of us get involved in investment setups where we actually have no edge whatsoever, none, but we somehow think we're going to win. Okay, that's not a good idea.
All right, questions? Gentleman in the back.
Thank you for speaking to us today. We talked a little bit about real estate right now. What would be your opinion on political construct on what to do with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac next?
Repeat the question a little bit, too.
So the question is, what to do with Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae? Let me just predict nothing much is going to happen. Okay? There's going to be a very gradual attempt to shrink them very slightly, but nothing major. Because we as a country, and China has done the same thing with its stock market, we as a country pursued a public policy of home ownership. More home ownership is a good thing. China pursued a policy of more people that own the stock market is a good thing. Why? It gives them a stake in reforms. So you think it's a public good. And we created a very big infrastructure around that. And it's not easy to deflate. Okay, so there isn't going to be, I don't think anything, there's going to be lots of talk, but when it comes to action, nothing really radical that's going to happen to Freddie and Fannie. If we were to reconstruct the system, we would do it very differently, but we don't have that luxury right now.
Next question. Gentleman up here.
How do you reconcile Fed people, one side say we have 1 to 2 rate increases, and Fed chair says we were thinking about or negative interest rates is not out of the question. They're two entirely different.
Yeah, while you answer that question, why don't you also tell us whether the Fed's going to increase rates in June and what the most likely scenarios are?
Okay, so the question was, how do you reconcile what has been really inconsistent communication from the Fed? Okay, if you listen to them in December, we were going to get four rate hikes. Of course, the market didn't like that. Come February, markets told them very loudly, we don't like that. So they come out and say, well, we may get 2. And then they ask, could we get negative interest rates? They say, well, we talked about it, right? So Fed communication is all over the place. Okay. Why? A number of reasons. First is that they're not getting the signals that they used to be able to get. When you distort a system for so long, you no longer get the signals no longer come as well as before. So it makes you, quote, data dependent. Data dependent. Now data goes all over the place, right? So then you start saying one thing based on one set of data and say something else based on another set of data. I haven't gotten very many things right in my life, but the one thing I've gotten right so far is this notion that we got to swing around, and at the end of the day, we will iterate on the following. And the following, and this is a prediction, the Fed will hike at least one more time this year, most likely 2 more times, and then will stop. It will stop, it will assess where it's going, etc. When, if it wasn't for the British referendum, which is a week after they meet, I would sit right here and I'd say, I'm pretty sure it's going to be in June. But there is this big event, and we're going to get a lot of data from the polls, and if the data shows that it's an iffy proposition, then I suspect the Fed may not hike. But if you take me to July and you say, what's the chance that by the end of July, so either in June or in July, we've got a hike, I will tell you extremely high. Take me to the September meeting, I'll tell you 100%. Okay, now that's not what the market have priced in at all.
So we can all make money on that.
Well, if you had listened to me a week ago, the probability of a rate hike in June by the market was priced at less than 4%. Today it's almost 30%. That's how far we've moved based on the few comments. Now, the other side of this is that equity gets really volatile. Okay, so I'm not sure we want me to be right.
Mm-hmm. This side of the room. Yes.
In the end of 2014, the gentleman that spoke to this group, I think somebody you personally know, and he was talking about the situation with interest rates and what the Fed is doing. And he said, an unintended consequence was they created 2 economies. One was the financial economy. They give you guys free money, and they take that money sometimes sitting in cash, they put it in bonds, make money, it's arbitrage profit, right? And he said, now the usual economy is the one we live in, which is, we earn money, we make money, and they borrow off the banks, and banks borrow off the companies, and interest rate is low, and they create, a building economy. So he said they unintentionally created 2 economies. And he said, I don't know if those guys are smart enough to figure out how to get out of it. Since you've been around so many board governors, or federal governors, do you think they are that bright that they can actually figure out how to get out of this scenario?
That's a great question. First, they did create 2 economies, right? Quite a predictable economy, finance. Why? Because they were coming in, pre-announced when they were going to come in, when they were going to buy. And if you're selling something, there's nothing you like more than a certain buyer, right? So the whole industry started focusing on what is the Fed going to do. Not what is the real economy going to do, because that's ultimately what generates value, but what is the Fed going to do? And if you have an institution with a printing press in the basement, you pay attention to it, right? So we all started focus. So that bit of the world, which was being subsidized by very low interest rates, did well. This bit of the world didn't do as well because very little of the money flowed this way. As much as the Fed put money into the system, as much as the reserves of the commercial banks at the Fed went up. The money wasn't being lent on. Ask the banks why, they'll give you two reasons. One is, at the same time as Washington had its foot on the accelerator when it came to liquidity, it had its foot on the brakes when it came to regulation. It made it very difficult for us to lend, right? So one foot is on the accelerator and the other foot is on the brakes. And the other reasons is because we as shareholders are much less tolerant of banks making mistakes. So if you're a bank management, you want to be really convinced about the creditworthiness of where you lend to. So the result of that is exactly what you said, and exactly whoever the speaker in 2014 was, which is you get two economies. How good are the central banks at realizing this? 100%. How good are they at navigating it? It's really hard because it's not just up to you. The legacy of the central banks is going to be written by somebody else. It's going to be whether the politicians step up to the plate. If the politicians step up to the plates, they will be viewed as having been part of the solution. If the politicians do not step up to the plate, they will be viewed as having been part of the problem, right? So you know, the real question, I'll keep on going back to it, this is not a call on the Fed. This is a call on Congress and how you feel Congress is going to evolve over the next 2 to 3 years as it becomes clear that we're coming to the end of the road.
Yes, sir.
Speaking of regulation, what's your opinion of the CFPB, and have they done more harm for consumers or help consumers?
So I don't know enough about the Consumer Protection Agency, what you're asking about.
All the federal regulations. Dodd-Frank,
Yeah,
Volcker Rule. Good thing or bad thing?
Richard, we have a massive crash on the 405 because a few people are driving really irresponsibly. So your first reaction is to lower the speed limit to slow everybody down because you can't afford another crash. Good idea or bad idea?
Bad idea.
Bad idea. Because?
Because traffic is going to be slow forever and it's going to be inefficient.
But can you afford another crash that kills so many people?
Well, in my opinion, I don't know, it's a different metaphor. But when it comes to the freeway, I don't want them to lower the speed limits. I'm going to rush.
No. So let's ask, how many people would keep it without a speed limit? Let's make it an excess. Without a speed limit and say, you know what, that's efficient. And if we get a few crashes, that's beside the point. How many people? Okay, and how many people would put up a speed limit till they understood better what went on the 405?
About half and half.
Okay, so half and half. That's the dilemma of the regulators. Okay? That's the dilemma of the regulators. And I think if we look back, we will find that the pendulum of regulation, just like it swung towards way too little regulation, will swing towards too much regulation. But just to be clear, it doesn't mean that the risks have disappeared. All right? Risks have a way of morphing and migrating. So if you tell me right now, am I worried about the banking system? No, I think we have the strongest banking system in the world, and that the likelihood of a bank problem again is very small. If you tell me where has the risk migrated, it has migrated to non-banks. And in particular, this belief that we collectively have that when the world changes, we're going to be able to reposition our stock portfolios. If you are an investor in Facebook, in Apple, and anything widely held stock, you get taken on massive roller coaster that has nothing to do with the company. It has to do with whether people change perception of two things. One, that central banks will always have our back covered, as they have had since 2008. And two, that growth, while low, will remain stable. Whenever there's a questioning of this, as we've discovered for the last week, then lots of stocks start moving, even though the corporate fundamentals haven't changed at all. And that's because liquidity is not there when we collectively change our minds.
Wow, it keeps getting more and more. Yes, sir.
Thanks again for sharing your thoughts. I'm interested if you have a point of view on the minimum wage going to $15, whether that'll help or hurt in terms of.
Let's break into two questions. I like that. One, if California has raised it and most of the country doesn't, how does that affect California? And second, if the whole country does, how does that affect our competitiveness in the world?
You know, whenever you're speaking, there is that moment in time where you get very close to the line that separates courage from stupidity. And most people realize this and step back. I'm going to cross it. I think net, so after you take all the consideration, a higher minimum wage makes sense. And you can now ask me to leave, okay? But I say to this as an economist, okay? We have a problem of aggregate demand. We have a problem that we're not able to secure sufficient living standards for certain people. And I don't believe that at record profits, our businesses are going to suddenly shut down because part of their wage bill is going to go up. A more difficult question, and you didn't ask it, but in a year's time we're going to be asking this, is something called universal basic income. And if you haven't read up on basic income yet, you should. And that is really hard. And the argument goes that with jobs being displaced at an accelerated rate by robots, and as the benefits of all this accrues to a smaller part of the population, is there an obligation to guarantee a basic income? Right? Now that's really hard, but that is what we're going to be debating in 12 to 24 months' time. Okay, it's already starting a little bit, but people realize that there's a significant displacement of labor going on. And then your question is, does it make sense if California moves and others don't move? It's not great, but
How's it going to affect California competitively?
I don't think labor mobility is quite as high. I mean, I'm not sure that my McDonald's can go and set up in Oregon because they're not going to get the consumers in Oregon, okay?
But a sewing plant can move.
It can, but if you look at where these minimum wage jobs are concentrated, right? They're mostly concentrated in what's called the non-tradable sector, things that can't actually get up and move that easily.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're talking about public policy. What are your thoughts about all this talk about we're going to punish companies from producing things overseas, we're going to institute tariffs if you move your plant to Mexico? How will that affect our economic well-being in this country if we were to do those types of things?
So the easiest thing to do when you're having trouble is to blame your neighbors. And if your neighbors happen to be foreign, that's great, okay? And that comes to us all naturally. Right? That's whatever country you're in, that's really, if in Greece it's the Turks. Something goes wrong, it's the Turks. In English, it's the French, right? So it's a very natural reaction. So none of this surprises me at all, and it plays well. There is an important point, which is sometimes free trade is not fair trade. And that distinction is really important. So if you are subjected here to consumer protection regulation or workers' protection regulation, and another country abuses its consumers or its workers, that's an issue, okay? But that's an issue of fair trade, not free trade. At the end of the day, I think you'll find it's really hard to do a lot of what's being said on the campaign trail.
Seems like one of the unintended consequences of QE and everything that's going on, your particular insight in this, given your work with Allianz, is life insurance.
Right.
Is there some serious risk to that industry?
So the question is there serious risk to the insurance companies of low and negative interest rates? The answer is yes. In fact, anybody that makes a promise, pensions, insurance companies, you saving for your kid's education, especially if your kid happens to be below the age of 5, is really challenging. Be very careful today when you enter into forward promises financially, because the system has borrowed the returns from the future. So unless really good things happen, the system can't generate the returns. My former colleague, Paul McCulley, said you don't go to heaven twice for the same deed, right? Right. So you can't generate, so anybody right now who promises long-term returns is challenged. And if it's negative interest rates, the system starts imploding. And that's what we're seeing in Japan. People disengage. The hottest selling thing in Japan today are home safes, because people don't want to pay their bankers for keeping their money. So they'd rather keep it at home than pay their bankers. Now, what does that mean? It means that people disengage from the financial system, and that's bad news for everybody.
Over in the back, the
So
young lady.
how do you select?
Over there, just randomly. I don't know how I do it. I'm trying to mix it around the room. A little louder, please.
I know you're a leading influential economist. One little small comment on minimum wage at McDonald's. When it goes up, I see my Big Mac go up. And interestingly, I see it doesn't go up as much in a different McDonald's as in my more expensive McDonald's. But my real question is, you say it's Congress and its structure and its function that is the solution, not so much who we elect as the leader. My question is, does Congress know this? And who is the solution person in Congress that's leading them? Is it Paul Ryan? Maybe such as you? That's my question.
Repeat it, please.
That's the solution that
All right.
I don't know how will it happen.
That is a great question, right? That is, and basically you're asking about leadership, right? You're saying, where is leadership today? That's basically what you're saying. And we haven't seen it. We haven't seen it anywhere, okay? And we haven't seen it because anybody who says, I'm the leader, finds that the consequences of saying I'm the leader are not really wonderful, okay? So if we are going to continue on this, and that's why I say we're going to need something of a crisis to wake people up. Hopefully not a huge crisis, but we're going to need some, because this is how we could. Now, before we blame our politicians, let me tell you that we are no different. When I didn't start the book hoping to come out with the worst answer you can, which is, the road is going to end, but I'm not going to tell you what happens next. That doesn't sell books, okay? People want to know, tell me, is it this or is it that? I don't care about your T-junction. I want clarity. The intellectual response is, I can't give you clarity because it depends, and it depends in a big way. But then I discovered something else. I discovered that we, as humans, make really bad decisions when we face a T-junction. Behavioral science, which studies how we make decisions, tells us that at least 3/4 of the room, if this is representative, will make bad decisions. 1/4 will have a blind spot. And there's nothing wrong with blind spots. We all have blind spots. We won't see the T-junction. It doesn't register. There's nothing wrong with having blind spots because we all have them. Okay, the answer to a blind spot is just like that little light that comes on in your mirror in new cars that tells you there's a car in your blind spot, right? But we have blind spots, and there's good scientific reason. So 1/4 of the room is going to be completely unaware of all this, and is going to wake up one day and find that we've pivoted, and will be very surprised, which means I won't have prepared for it. A second group will do what married couples do all the time. Hear one thing and believe something else, okay? It's called reframing. You reframe the issue. Why? Because it takes you out of your comfort zone. And we are built to defend our comfort zone. Okay? Now, how do we do it? The simple example is if I tell you your flight leaves at 2 o'clock from LAX, you know what to do. If I come and tell you it's either going to leave at 8 a.m. or 8 p.m., that will most likely paralyze you. Because, what do you mean a flight can leave at 8 a.m. or 8 p.m.? That's what a T-junction is, either here or here, not here, okay? What the behavioral scientists tell you is the most likely thing that's going to go on in your mind, and you're going to be not very aware of that, is you're going to say, wow, well, 8 a.m., 8 p.m., that doesn't even make sense. What's the midpoint between the two? Or 2 p.m. I'll turn up for a 2 p.m. flight. The third group is even worse. Okay, and businesses do this all the time. It's called active inertia. You hear something, you form a committee, you get active, you get excited, you got to do something differently, and then you go do the same, exactly the same. The non-politically correct example is the American tourist in Paris. He or she goes up to a French person and asks for something in English. The French person either doesn't want to understand or doesn't understand English. In most cases, the American will say the same thing in English but louder. Okay? That is active. The person realizes they haven't been understood, so they get active, but they do exactly the same thing. IBM on the eve of the PC revolution. And the research on this is really clear. They realized that the PC was a disruptive technology. That part of their client base and a lot more people would migrate to the PC, and those that use the mainframe would expect the mainframe to do more things, to go up the value-added curve. So they realized they couldn't continue on the road, and they had to meet both sides of the T, get active in the PC world and migrate their mainframe. Management came up with a strategy. The board approved the strategy. When it came to implementation, they couldn't implement up here. Why? Because the comfort zone was down here. And they ended up doing the same, and they got eaten alive first by Compaq, then HP, and if they didn't completely reinvent themselves, they wouldn't be available today. So the third group is going to be the active inertia. We believe we're active, we believe we understand it, and we end up doing exactly the same thing. And only a small group of us, if you don't react today to making sure that you're not in that category of the other three, is going to understand this. So I tell you, what the politicians have to do is really quite hard. They have to change their mindset. They have to take themselves out of the comfort zone. They have to be willing to collaborate with the other side. So it's not that easy, but all of us also are going to be challenged in a similar way.
I want to try to end this in a fairly positive note. One thing that has been positive about the world's economy for the last several decades has been China's economy, which was impoverished, and now it's the second largest economy in the world, growing double digit. Now people are saying, oh my God, it's growing at only 6%, but if you don't compare it to the past, but just compare it to, is that a driver or is that a drag? Isn't 6% growth, or is there really 6% growth? That's what I read. Isn't that still a positive for the world's economy? And aren't there other places like India that's also a huge economy that may be having growth like that? Is there some possible positives from the outside world to drive demand?
Well, I mean, there's lots of questions here. Let me just start with, the world looks the following. It's getting more and more uneven, okay? So you have a set of countries that are going to do okay. Not great, but okay. China and the United States are going to do okay. You have a much smaller set of countries, India, that are going to do better. You have a third set of countries that are going to struggle. Europe, 1 to 1.5% growth. Japan, 1% if they're lucky. And then you have the troublemakers. They're in recession, okay? And the question is, do they disrupt other people? Brazil, Venezuela, Russia, okay? That is what the global economy looks like. The official term is multi-speed, but it's going to get increasingly uneven. So unless we coordinate it a little bit better, it just becomes harder. China, I'm not a China pessimist, okay? I think people fail to understand what China is going through. The reason why China is slowing down is natural. You cannot continue to grow at 10% per annum forever. The world isn't big enough. There aren't enough Walmarts to sell to, okay? So you have to go through what is the trickiest transition for a country, which is called the middle income transition. It's going from being a teenager to an adult. When you're a teenager, things change very quickly. When you're an adult, you settle into a period of greater stability, but less growth. Only 5 countries in the last 100 years have managed that transition. And it's not an easy transition, and none of them have been as big and as complicated as China. They're doing that in the midst of dealing with the financial bubble in the stock market, which I talked about earlier, and the global economy slowing down. So is China going to look uneven? Of course it is. Of course it is. Does that mean it's going to hard land? No. Why? Because they, unfortunately, for us, have the best set of policymakers. And they don't have to worry about elections every 2 years. And their policymaking is completely different to ours. If you go today to Congress and say, I want to do this to get to this point in the next 10 years, you're going to say, what are you going to do in year 1? What are you going to do in year 2? What are you going to do in year 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9? And they will not approve your 10-year vision unless you tell them what you're going to do. Now, that's really hard. China is very different. China says, I know I want to be in 10 years' time, and I only know what I'm going to do this year. But I'm going to learn, and I'm going to adapt, and I'm going to self-correct, and I'm going to make sure that I self-correct, keeping my vision up there for where I want to be in 10 years. That is a much better way to do economic policy, but it also requires you to be undemocratic, all right? And that's the trade-off.
So we do have some positives in the global economy, a fast-growing second largest economy in the world. I took heart at the idea of we have all this innovation that we haven't even really measured, so we're really better off aggregately, of course, this inequality. We've got capital on the sidelines. You're saying those are usually two really great things. And there's also some, I don't know who said it, but when it comes to America's policy, this is not something new, but it's been said that we always do the right thing after all other alternatives are exhausted. So with that, on an optimistic note, Steve, why don't you wrap it up for us? Thank you so much for being our guest. I enjoyed it. I hope you did too.
Well, that's our program for today. Thank you for attending. I will say I just bought a new Corvette, so I think I'm a no speed limit kind of guy on the freeway. But fascinating discussion. I wish we had another hour. I have 10 questions I want to ask. Maybe I can get you to go out to lunch with me one of these days in the near future. But just a couple of quick announcements before you leave. Those of you wishing to have Dr. El-Erian sign your book that you purchased today, and we did sell over 80 books, so there are a number of them. I mentioned earlier that he takes his daughter to school in the morning. Well, he picks her up in the afternoon too. So he needs to leave by 2 o'clock. 2:30? Oh, okay, then we have a little extra time. But please, bring your book up and say a couple nice things to him, and please move down the line. If you haven't purchased a book and you still would like to, we have a few extra for sale. See Pam Smith, she's over at the door there. She'll be outside. They're $25 a piece. Thank you all for coming. If you're interested in attending future programs put on by the Chamber of Commerce, we do things fairly regularly here. We have all kinds of different offerings. Please go to our website, newportbeach.com. And last thing I could say is if you're not a member of the Chamber of Commerce, you should be. Thank you.